But here's the thing, there's a cost to living. There's a cost to living as if we know who someone is by what they look like. And the cost of living that way is to not to be able to see God in all of its faces and facets. We give that up. We give that up. I got some stories. I mean, the inspiration from this topic, though, came from a visit I made to the hospital. I was going to visit a friend of mine's mother. Where is she? She's supposed to be here today, Olivia Shaw. I went to see her mother in the hospital. And what that is evidence of is that there is opportunity for spiritual growth no matter where you are. I mean, no matter where you're going, what's happening, everywhere. You just have to be awake and aware. Like you can't go to sleep. You have to be awake and aware. And then when you have an engagement like that, if you have an encounter like that, then you have to remember you had the encounter. You have to take it in. You have to take it in, you have to remember it, and then you have to try to incorporate it into your life. I mean, that's what it takes. Instead of just oh, that was nice. You know, that kind of thing we've all done. Oh, that was nice, and then we're on to the next thing. We're on to business as usual, we call it. Well, let me tell you, there's no spiritual growth in business as usual. You already know that. Business as usual, that's what that means, right? It's business as usual. We don't have an opportunity for spiritual growth there. We have to get out of that, oh, that was nice. That's not the way it works. If we want to have spiritual growth, if we want to be awake and aware, that's not where the buck stops. Sometimes when we have that experience that makes us pause, that gives us pause, that we're like, oh, you know, we have to let it change us. We have to let it change our paradigm. Instead of just being moved by what we encounter, we have to be changed by what we encounter, okay, in daily living. It reminds me of this quote, and I included it in our latest newsletter, but I want to read it again from David Rico, and it's, a spiritually evolved adult seeks not answers, but significance. Isn't that what we really want in life? Like, most of us, you know, we get tired of scratching the surface after a while. You know, we can scratch the surface and it's still the surface, but we want to really get down to the significance, like the meaning of stuff, when we take the time to contemplate. We're not satisfied after a while just scratching the surface. So anyway, here's the story. So I'm going over to the hospital, and Olivia's mom is there, and when I arrive, it wasn't either that day or the day before when they had decided that she was going into hospice care. And the moment I arrived, there was this burly kind of guy in there. He had tattoo sleeves. He had these those expanded earring things in his ears. And he's leaning over her, and I'm thinking, holy cow, who's this guy, right? And Olivia's standing there with this real tenderness in her eyes, looking at him with her mother. Come to find out that he had been taking care of her over the last few days. He had been bathing her. He had been taking care of a lot of intimate things with her, and he had been really, in essence, loving her in a very intimate way during that time. And it so happened that on that particular day, he was not on that side of the hallway in the hospital or whatever, but heard that she was heading out to hospice care and came over to her to say goodbye. And when he turned around after I had been there, he was saying whatever he was saying, he turned around, he had tears in his eyes. He had tears in his eyes. Gives me goosebumps right now thinking about that. And I'm thinking to myself, how often do we look at people and decide by how they look who they are? How often do we do that? You know, how often is that the extent of what we know, what we think we know, is how they look. In that one moment, I thought that. And I thought, you know, this kind of stuff happens every day. We judge people for exactly how they look. And it reminded me of, you know, you've probably seen that show, America's Got Talent, either sometime or another, right? And there's this little girl who's 11 years old, and she opens her mouth and she sounds like a seasoned opera singer. And everybody goes, oh. Or the little boy who's sitting at a piano. Feet don't even touch the pedals, and he's a virtuoso. He's playing something that none of us could ever even dream about. Well, maybe Kay could. She's really good at piano. Or there's this nerdy-looking kid who just steals our heart. Or this 60-year-old woman who comes out, she's going to give a stand-up comedy routine, and we're going, yeah, right, she's going to say something I think is funny. But then what happens? Simon Cowell is the one who has the look, and he's just like, right? And we're at home going, wow, wow. Like, the universe loves to play with us that way, don't you think? The universe loves that. But here's the thing, it's not just America's Got Talent. Those are some, examples that I thought were very curious and that explain this idea that I wanted to talk about today. But this happens every day with people we run into all the time. We look at their hair, we look at their face, we look at their body, they're skinny, they're fat, they're this. We look at the clothes they wear, how they smell, what they have in their shopping cart. Have you ever done that? Going, oh man. But have you noticed that you don't judge so harshly the people that are more like you? Do you? If that shopping cart is full of things that you usually buy, you're like, oh, yeah. If it's not, we're judgmental, aren't we? We're not so harsh. I think we like to label people. We like to put people in boxes because it's easier for us. It's easier to talk about that. It's easier to understand people. It's easier maybe and more comfortable for us to know who's in our tribe and who's not in our tribe. And so we like to do that, put people in boxes. And because people who look different than we look take us outside of our comfort zone, don't they? Sometimes they do. And outside of our comfort zone is uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. But think about it. Is that what you like? Would you like to be labeled for what you have on today, for how your hair looks, for how old you are, for if you wear glasses or not, if you're fat or skinny, how you smell, what you have in your cart? Is that how you want to be labeled? Well, of course not. We want to sit down with someone. We want to share our story. It's like, let's have a cup of tea and a scone, right? Something we can do together. Something we get to know each other. That's really what we want. We don't want to be labeled by what we look like. I know I don't. I don't think I look this way. I can't even watch myself on video. Ask Renee, did you see yours? I said, no. Not going to look at that. I'm not going to look at that. But here's the thing. There's a cost to living. There's a cost to living as if we know who someone is by what they look like. And the cost of living that way is to not to be able to see God in all of its faces and facets. We give that up. We give that up, that experience of understanding God, showing up like the tattooed, burly, earring, long-haired man who has a family and kids and who cared for this, 98-pound woman, bathing her. We give up knowing God like that. That's what happens. Oh my gosh, do we want to live that way? I don't. I think instead of judgment, instead of being judgmental, we need to be more curious. We need to be more curious about people and not be afraid because they're different. So I have a couple stories about that. Renee and I went to the Pride Festival on Castle Street. Anybody else go there? We were at the Pride Festival and walking around, and we frequent, well, we don't frequent, every once in a while our friend John owns Wilmington Wine there. So we were walking in the street and said, let's go see John. And so we went in and had a glass of wine, and I was standing right next to this very handsome woman who actually was a man dressed like a woman, but very handsome. And I commented on her face. I was like, you have something I said about her face, like, you have a handsome face. And we started talking. And we started talking about, she gave me her story. And don't you know, this particular man, who was dressed like a woman, wasn't a transgender person, so I'm not sure even what pronoun is correct. But she was an entertainer, so she had been in a stage entertainer for like 20 years. She had done this. No kidding. She had much better looking legs than I'll ever have. And she happened to be, at one time, back in the 1970s, late 1970s, she happened to be on the Pittsburgh Steelers football team. That was where she started. And that's the connection we made, because I lived and grew up in the town where the Pittsburgh Steelers train in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And I said, oh my gosh, I used to ride my bicycle to see you guys practice. And she said, yeah, I was there. I said, remember, it was back when, before all the crowds showed up. I mean, I was a kid, I rode my bicycle there and parked it and sat in the shade. Nobody was there. And so we had this connection, and we talked about it. She shared her story. What a wonderful way to connect with someone very different than me. You know, that's how we do it. We become curious. We become curious, we can ask questions, we can share our life story together. Makes all the difference. On our way out of the festival, when we were at the street fair, we passed by where the stage was, and there was a stage show going on. And we were standing, we weren't watching the stage, we were up. I said, Renee, I want to pause here. And I paused and looked at all these young people. Most of them were young people. And they were dancing, and they were happy, and they were dressed in all these crazy ways that I would never dress when I was a kid. But they, oh no, this is bugging me. Let me just pause a minute here. So, and they were so happy. You know, these transgender youth, these LGBTQI, all the letters that describe them in a way. There's another label, by the way. But they were so happy, and they were jumping around, and I could feel and sense the freedom that they felt to be exactly who they wanted to be in that moment and how they wanted to be. And it made me feel so good to observe that about them. It was such a cool thing. And right in front of us, too, Renee pointed out, there were these two dads with this little boy. And we didn't have to say anything to them. We didn't have to question anything, but just to feel the sameness in us, to feel the freedom that I feel that these kids may have not felt in their own lives or wherever. It was an amazing thing. People different than me, different than Renee, but being able to make that connection. There's another story that I saw on the internet about a nurse who had come across. She was in, I don't know where it was, but she was driving along the road a couple years ago, and she saw an accident. These bikers had been in an accident. And she is a nurse, so she pulled off to the side of the road, and she was helping. It was a pretty severe accident. There were some people who were really hurt badly there. And she stopped, but once the medics got there, she went on her way. And she was curious, though, how those folks, if they survived, how they were doing, so she checked out their Facebook page for those folks. And they started making a connection. So when her daughter, a year later, wanted to have a lemonade stand and she advertised it on Facebook, the biker guy said, yeah, we'll be there. Well, don't you know it was rained out? It was rained out, so she didn't have it. But the biker guys told her, hey, have it next weekend. We'll be there. So that's what she did. And who showed up? 30 bikers showed up at the lemonade stand. 30 of them came, including some of those who were injured, showed up there. And of course her daughter was so surprised and happy, and they made her day. But here's what this woman said at the end of this article. Here's how she ended this interview. She said, I think it's a perfect example of how just because you don't look the same way, or dress the same way, or have the same hobbies or interests, doesn't mean that we don't have the same core values inside of us. We shouldn't make assumptions about people. We should just love each other. Yeah, because we do make assumptions too often. And we can't help but do it, but you know what we need to do is if we can, ask some questions, yes. Like I did with, I don't even know this woman's name that I spoke to at Wilmington Wine. But if we can't ask any questions, if it's not appropriate, check yourself. We should be checking ourselves. If I'm coming up, I'm seeing somebody and bypassing someone, and there's some angst coming up in me, if there's some judgment coming up in me, if there's something coming up in me, I should be asking myself, what's that about? Are you afraid of that? Do you not understand it? Do you need some more information? Is it just not the way you think it should be, Paula? Is it just not what you would wear? You know, what is that coming up in me? That's what it's about. You know, maybe ask a question and maybe not. These curveballs, I think, I'm calling these curveballs, are the universe saying, ha, gotcha. You know, it's the universe saying, I got you. You think you know the way I show up. You think you know the way God shows up. Guess what? You don't. You don't. You have no idea who you're talking to, who you're seeing, who you might be running into. You don't. Darn it. When we find ourselves, here's the thing. You cannot rely on outer appearances to determine the character, to determine the talent, to determine the way God is in that person. You cannot rely on outer appearances to do that. You cannot. It's not possible. Do you believe that? I believe that. We can't rely on that. We can't rely on outer experiences. If we find ourselves in one of those curveball moments, we need to lean into that curveball. We need to lean in. We don't need to back off or try to avoid it or pretend we didn't see it. We need to lean in. We need to lean in and know. Ask a question. Check ourselves. Ask ourselves the question about why that's showing up in me that way. That's what we need to do. Really. That's the key, is to engage positively, to engage thoughtfully with others, no matter what they look like. I think we'll be surprised more often than we think. I think curveballs like this should lead us to be more kind. It should lead us to be more godlike. It should lead us, rather than to want to be understood, to understand someone else. To understand someone else. And that reminded me, my friends, of the prayer of St. Francis. That reminded me. And I've changed it a little bit here because I can. But it reminded me of this. It said, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred in me, sow love. Where there is injury in me, sow forgiveness. Where there is doubt in me, sow faith. Where there is despair in me, sow hope. When there is darkness in me, sow light. And when there is sadness in me, sow joy. That's my prayer. And once the divine has opened me up that way, once the divine has come in and cleared it all out, then this is what happens. Grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console. To seek to be understood as to understand. To seek to be loved as to love. That's what it's really about. In the curveballs in life. So I hope that this idea and these stories and this information that I've shared with you, this helps you to turn the light on in yourself about people who are different than you, who look different. And to suspend judgment and encourage curiosity. That's what really, the way I think the divine walks around in this world. So let's take those ideas into meditation this afternoon. To seek to be, to not seek to be understood, but to understand. To understand, even when we feel fearful, even when we don't know, to simply be curious. To be curious. So let's take a deep breath in and out. To invite the curveballs, to lean in, to lean toward, to not run away, to realize. And maybe even to be in awe of how God shows up in the world. To be in awe of the Master's creation. To walk around seeing with the eyes of our heart. So breathe in and breathe out as we settle in for meditation. refuse to live locked in the orderly house of reasons and proofs. The world I live in and believe in is wider than that. And anyway, what's wrong with maybe? You wouldn't believe what once or twice I have seen. I'll just tell you this. Only if there are angels in your head will you ever possibly see one.